what people he talked to, and it explains already the future book he is going to write.
Traven's books were set in these same jungles, stories of the Indians who lived here. But if Croves did write the books, there's a further mystery. Traven's production more or less dried up round about 1939, yet Croves, who emerged for the first time in the early 40s, lived on. In the Croves era, new editions of the books began to be tampered with. German names and references were taken out, and clues to the past excised. There was a trickle of new stories in cheap magazines, and one long novel, Aslan Norval.
In Germany, it was considered a forgery by some Germans who thought it was not up to the caliber of the novelist B. Traven. But, I mean, he was old and sick, and it happens to other writers. Hemingway wasn't so great at the end.
Goss puts the case against Croves simply.
Yes, in one sentence, if he was B. Traven, why couldn't he write like B. Traven?
And we must remember Croves denied that he was Traven, even going so far as to say that Traven as a separate individual didn't exist, that his work was the joint product of two men. This notion, deriving from Croves himself, has been inherited by students of the Traven work. The theory that in Mexico one man had the experiences which another man wrote down. And if the writing half of that combination died or disappeared in 1939, it would explain why the other partner produced so little. But if the story of Traven includes two men, it now has to make room for a third, from a quite different part of the world.
Where is the Ziegelbrenner? Ret Marut, comrade, friend, fellow fighter, let's hear from you. Bestir yourself. Give a sign that you're alive. We need you.
It was a fellow anarchist who thought he had recognized in the works of B. Traven the voice of his old comrade, Ret Marut. Ret Marut, another strange name, but a real, even an historical figure. He'd been an actor in Germany, first heard of in 1907. We find his name as the player of bit parts on playbills. But later in Munich, he emerges as the editor of an anarchist newsletter, Der Ziegelbrenner, the brick burner, or the brick maker. The bricks were for the building of a new society, and the magazine, which came out during the First World War, was the size, shape, and colour of a brick. A fact that later in our researches, and to our great surprise, was to prove a determining factor in our discovery of who B. Traven actually was. But Marut, what was he like? He too insisted on anonymity.
I shall at all times prefer to be pissed on by dogs than to be pissed on by readers of Der Ziegelbrenner with letters that attempt to sniff out holes in my garment in order to pin me down.
Der Ziegelbrenner always carried the line,
No visiting allowed. There is never anyone at home. We have no telephone.
Had Marut gone to Mexico and become Croves? Croves would have been about 40 when we first come across him in Mexico in the 1920s, about the same age as Marut. Had Croves come from Germany? It would explain his accent. Croves denied he was Marut, and so did his wife. But the day after Croves died in this house in 1969, his widow retracted and claimed that he told her on his deathbed that she could now reveal that he had been Ret Marut.
Yes, he was Ret Marut. He was a writer there.
Then both you and your husband always, during his life, denied that he was Ret Marut.
That's right. He denied it.
And you also. What was the...
Well, I had to say what he told me to say.
Further circumstantial evidence that Croves was Marut is contained among the effects that Signora Lujan has preserved. She has a copy of the novel Marut wrote, which is extremely rare, and she has some original Ziegelbrenners. And Signora Lujan owns an interesting portrait.
After my husband died, the name Ret Marut was greatly publicized. And so his secretary, the secretary of Ret Marut, had it at home, and she sent it to me.
In Munich, Marut was an anarchist. He was a member of the Revolutionary Workers' Soviet in 1919. This was crushed by the authorities, and Marut was under sentence of death. He escaped, and for the next few years was on the run. But if Marut had become Croves and he was Traven, we have to track him to Mexico. Traven's first stories, The Cotton Pickers, were set in Mexico. All the manuscripts came from Mexico. But how did Marut leave Europe? At the end of 1922, he sent a postcard to a friend from Rotterdam.
In a few hours, I shall board a ship to take me across the Atlantic, and thereby I cease to exist.
That was the last anyone heard of Ret Marut until now. What we now know for certain is that in 1923 and 1924 he was in London. We know he was in London from documents unearthed from the CIA, the FBI, the State Department, and from the Home Office in London. There we found two hitherto unpublished pictures of Ret Marut, pulling a strange face to confuse the police. They were taken in London at that time. We compared them with photographs of Croves, and clearly they're the same man. The nose, the set of the lips, the ears. So the man who was undoubtedly here in London in 1924, on the run from the German authorities, was Croves, was Torsvan, and was Ret Marut. He had arrived in August 1923, and by December he'd been arrested for failing to register as an alien, something he couldn't do because he had no papers. At Thames Police Court, he was recommended for deportation. And for the next 2 months, he was held here, in Brixton Prison in South London. During this time, political friends he had in London, and they apparently included Sylvia Pankhurst, the early fighter for women's rights, were trying to get him an American passport. If Marut could prove that he was American, he could avoid being sent back to Germany and a possible execution. He was released from Brixton Prison and came to lodge in Commercial Road, Limehouse. He took a room over a tobacconist's shop that used to stand on this site here. And there he stayed for 2 months before being put on board ship. The shop itself was pulled down about 20 years ago. He didn't get the American passport, and the ship he finally left on was called the Hegre, a Norwegian vessel bound for Tenerife via Brixham. It sailed from here in the London docks on April the 19th, 1924, and we know from a document in the American consul's office in London that he was working his passage as a fireman. The hero of the death ship was also a fireman, and the parallel is hard to avoid. It would have been impossible, therefore, for him to have got to Mexico before the middle of 1924. This poses a problem. If he didn't get to Mexico until then, could he have absorbed so much of the life of that country, earned his living, and still have had time to write The Cotton Pickers so that it arrived in Germany under the name B. Traven in the first part of 1925? Both Goss and Michael Baumann, another Traven scholar, think it unlikely that he could have written the books in time. Bauman.
There is sufficient evidence, not only in the novelist, but in the one non-fiction work that has been published so far, that the man who wrote in the first person had lived in Mexico for at least 10, perhaps 15 or 20 years before Red Marwood could have gotten to Mexico.
But Senora Lujan sees no difficulty.
I mean, he wrote all the books. There are his diaries, how he wrote practically page by page. Being a born narrator, it was easy for him to write those stories.
But if the Mexican work of Traven